Welcome to Massey College. Bienvenue. My name is Nathalie Desrosiers, and I'm the principal of Massey College. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this fourth season of the Massey Dialogue, where we take questions of actuality and try to develop them and discuss them among our community, leveraging the great power of the Massey community. So I'm delighted all the ways that the Massey Dialogue focuses on having an intergenerational discussion where we have members of our junior fellowship being part of the discussion. So I want to acknowledge that Massey College is built on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are conscious of our duty of stewardship toward the land and the great privilege that we have to continue to do our work here. And without further ado, I'm just going to let this dialogue start. What a great subjects, racism and sport. Are sports institution part of the solution or part of the problem?
Thank you very much, Natalie. And thank you for everyone who has made the time to be part of this discussion. My name is Akaash Maharaj, and it's my great pleasure and my great privilege to be moderating today's discussion. As Natalie said, our subject is inclusion, racism, and power in Canada. Are sport institutions part of the solution or part of the problem? I think all of us have become accustomed to the idea of the level playing field being the universal metaphor for fair play, meritocracy, and equality of opportunity. And historically, there are very powerful figures who have lived out that truth. Jesse Owens at the Berlin 1936 Olympics, laying waste to ideas of racial superiority before the very eyes of fascist leaders. Jackie Robinson striding over the baseball's color line at a time when racial segregation was still the law of the land across the United States. And more recently still, South Africa's multiracial rugby team playing a role in knitting that country back together after the fall of apartheid. But still more recently, we've seen a mixed record. We have seen athletes rush to take up roles using their positions in society to advance social causes like anti-racism and inclusion. We've seen brands embrace the commercial and profit motive. We've also seen leagues reject this. We've seen the NFL resist Black Lives Matter, and we've seen the International Olympic Committee ban anti-racist statements from the podium. The question we're here to discuss is, are Canada's sport institutions using their influence to advance or to restrain sport as a vehicle for social inclusion? In effect, in the 21st century, is organized sport a teammate or an opponent in the struggle against racism? And is sport itself helping to strengthen or helping to weaken the level playing field? When we decided to hold this discussion, there were three people who were our first choice, and I'm delighted to say that all three of them accepted and are here today. We'll hear first from Devin Heroux. He is a reporter with CBC Sports and CBC News. Originally from Saskatoon, he was captivated by the Olympic Winter Games, watching the Saskatchewan curling team, led by Sandra Schmerler, win gold at Nagano in 1998. He now makes his home in Toronto and hosts that curling show. He also provided coverage for the Toronto Raptors NBA Championship, the US Open Tennis, Grey Cups, and many different sporting world championships. And most recently of all, he was on the ground in Tokyo as a senior writer for CBC and Radio-Canada's coverage of the Tokyo 2020 Olympics and Paralympics. We're also joined by Lashante Henry, who is a junior fellow at Massey College. She is a law student at the University of Toronto's Faculty of Law and previously completed a degree in commerce and an MBA from Laurentian University. At Laurentian, she captained the women's varsity basketball team, and she now volunteers with Law in Action within schools, with the Journal of Law and Equality, and with the International Human Rights Program. Alex Ikejiani, I'm really sorry. I even asked you to pronounce your name properly. That is my fault. He's an environmental lawyer and certified specialist in environmental law. He's been a lawyer for 23 years and focuses on environmental law, regulatory prosecution, oceans and resource management law. And he works for Canada's Department of Justice. He also lectures at the University of Ottawa. He is a former student athlete and a former member of the University of Manitoba men's basketball team, and represented Nova Scotia at the Canada Games. He gives back to collegiate sports by speaking to teams about ethics and systemic discrimination, and he's the director of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport. And so we will begin first with an opening conversation with Devin. Devin, one of the things that really strikes me about your coverage of sport and your prolific skills as a tweeter is that you clearly feel a great deal of joy in sport. You can see that you are someone who loves sport and loves what sport brings to society. And you're also someone who sees sport as a vehicle for bringing about meaningful social change. Can you tell us a bit about your interest in sport and how you see sport, the overlap between sport and social issues?
Good to be with you, Akaash, and thank you to Massey College for this, and really honored to be a part of what I believe is a timely conversation. Timely in the fact that I believe not enough people are talking about this topic. We always go through cycles, and so this is an important conversation to be having right now. I love sport, so thank you for picking up on that and my tweeting. For me, sport and life and collectivism and community and society have all been intertwined, and so it's been a long journey through all of this for me. And like you said, it brings me a lot of joy. And I think for me, through my journey in sports coverage, very early on as a sports editor at the University of Saskatchewan, I took it upon myself in a great responsibility, really, to realize that I wanted to make people care about sport and about people who were playing the sports, and appeal to a large audience. So, how do you do that? How do you make people who may not necessarily care about how many goals were scored, how many baskets were scored, how many touchdowns were scored? How do you make people care about sport? And it's interesting because you're talking about is sport a teammate or an opposition? I think in this way, sport is sort of this disarming thing where you can come to watch the game. And how long have we heard the phrase, just shut up and dribble, and sport shouldn't be political? People from all stripes are coming to watch sport. But to me, it was important that within the field of play, we were talking about all those social issues and the confluence and the intersectionality of all that athletes bring to the field. And I try and do that in a very intentional way because, like I said, sport is this joyous thing where everybody comes together from all backgrounds. A lot of people will say they don't want to hear about the social issues, but when you have their attention, when you have that audience, I think that's the time to be having these conversations. And I think last summer, in this sort of unprecedented and unparalleled time in the chaos of the pandemic, we saw athletes understanding their important privileged voice in pro sports unlike any other time. And so for the longest time, the cost for speaking up, for making stands, for having protests, it was too costly. But I really believe that the pendulum is swinging, Akaash. So that's what I would say to start. I love sport. I love all that it brings, but I also love all the conversations around sport that can be had in, like I said, that very sort of disarmed way. And then you're in the heart of the conversation.
Well, that's an interesting point that you make, that there has been a burst of interest and activity from athletes to make statements about social issues, especially about anti-racism and questions of inclusion. Do you think that's because athletes are, as you say, conscious of the fact that they have an audience and and feel perhaps a responsibility to put that audience to good use? Or do you think it's that athletes feel that the same social issues of racism and exclusion intrude or have an effect on who gets to that level playing field, who makes it onto the field of play? What, in your experience as a keen observer of sport, has caused this burst of interest in athletes to speak out?
I think for the longest time, I think for a very long time, athletes have been aware of their position. But I think also for the longest time, there was too great of cost, too great of toll to speak out against those in power. The investigation that myself and my colleague Jamie Strachan did last summer, highlighting, let's be frank, let's call it what it is, the systemic racism that exists in our sporting system, specifically in Canada. Because, Akash, I don't have to tell people who are watching this or people on this panel, one of the things Canadians like to do is say, well, that doesn't happen here, and look to the South and say that's an American problem. And we said, no, we're going to shine the spotlight on Canadian universities and the sport framework in Canada. And we took a look at key positions: coaches, owners, athletic directors. We looked at the 56 universities under the umbrella of U Sports, and out of 56 universities in this country, only one was BIPOC. The rest of them, 55 athletic directors, are white. Board of directors at national sport organizations in this country, and you were in that, Akaash. Boards are mostly white. We looked at 400 positions among Canadian universities. Only about 10% of those positions were held by BIPOC representation. And those numbers were pretty much steady across the board in national sport organization and pro sports. And so the burden to speak out has always been too great. And yet when we started to see sort of this groundswell in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and that unprecedented 48 hours in sport of athletes saying, we're taking back the power, because if we don't take the court, if we don't take the field, the game actually doesn't go on. And I think there was sort of this power shift. It'll be interesting to see, because you had all these leagues and all these owners saying the right things at that time, but now that intensity has lessened and the performative stuff is through, it'll be really interesting to see, because let's be honest, at the end of the day, sport has always been about the bottom line and about padding the wallets of those privileged white, in a lot of cases, men at the top. And so I think we're finally starting to see some genuine change. I know a lot of the national sport organizations in this country are sort of mandating that their boards better reflect the athletes that are taking place in this, because for far too long, it's been the elite privilege who have been pulling the strings, and the athletes have been the puppets in the play. And they finally had enough to say, we're taking back the power. How meaningful that is as we move forward, and how much money plays a role in that, and sponsorship as well. Let's not forget about that. That will be the deciding thing. But I want to believe that the pendulum is headed in the right direction and it's swinging in the right way.
There's a lot of interesting observations. Let me start with pick up on the last one, on the question of cost and benefits. Certainly, to take the example of the NFL, then that's a case where the league decided that it wanted the cost, as it were, to itself, the social, political, or economic cost to itself of allowing someone like Colin Kaepernick to speak out was too high. But Nike decided that the cost of embracing him was a source of great profit rather than a source of cost. So do you think that in the economic calculus that leagues, sponsors, the entertainment industry of sport, do you think that they have come around to the idea that at least appearing to be inclusive is good for the bottom line? Or do you think they remain to be convinced of that?
I think they're still waiting to be convinced of that. I think you nailed it. The very question is spot on, because I think it's always a fluid situation, and you want to believe that the decision makers at Nike and the decision makers at the NFL are really doing this to be on the right side of history, to get it right. But the sad, stark reality, and we have too many examples throughout history, is that it's always been based on the bottom line. But at this point where we're at right now, Colin Kaepernick, Nike, Naomi Osaka, Serena Williams, and on, the people who have been carrying the weight and demonized for what they've done for quite some time. Well, now people are realizing, my goodness, maybe it is good for business to be on the right side of history. So that, I think, is where we're at right now. And I think, we're seeing some pressure by leagues and by international governing bodies threatening to pull out, but also sponsors putting pressure now on the flip side of it, saying we're not going to be sponsoring this event if it's held in this place of the world that has, to put it lightly, lackluster human rights sort of resume. So I think it's always an ongoing conversation, but I don't think I'm being too hyperbolic, Akaash, in stating that for a lot of these athletes who have carried this. I think of somebody like Gwen Berry, the American hammer thrower, who made a lot of news, and her and I have gotten to know each other very, very well. She was the one that at the Pan Am Games in Guadalajara held her fist up in the air, very much like Tommy Smith and John Carlos. And she was, all of those years later, demonized in the same way that those two were. So, there's a lot of things happening here where I think in sport, a lot of people want to pat themselves on the back for all of these steps forward. And yet when it comes to the vitriol and the hate and the backlash, 1968, Tommy Smith and John Carlos were kicked out of the Olympics. They were demonized in America. They were kicked off the track and field team. And now all of these years later, they're held up like heroes. But what are people doing and what is society doing when it matters right now? And I think what we're seeing is we're not as far as we would like to believe.
Thank you. So that's a lot. We'll now move on to Lashante. Lashante, let me ask you this. You are both an athlete and also a law student and someone who is involved with the law. I remember many years ago, I won't name him, but a minister of justice, a federal minister of justice, said to me that Canada does not have a justice system. We have a legal system, and that any connection between the law and justice is purely coincidental. With that bit of cynicism out of the way, do you think that there's an overlap between sport and law in the pursuit of justice?
I think that in some ways there is some overlap, and you can see that. Definitely, I think that, especially I played basketball, so I found that BIPOC members, we are invited to play. However, I didn't see many BIPOC coaches or athletic directors. So I think that it does overlap in that way where we are allowed to play as equals, but not rise to our full potential within that industry.
That's interesting. So if I understand you correctly, the pool of athletes is becoming more and more multiracial, but the corridors of power are still inhabited, are not.
Yes.
And do you have a sense of whether that is changing? Well, actually, even before that, let me ask you, do you have a sense that people feel that that's a problem?
I think that in light of recent events that we're starting to notice that is a problem. We see that in the workplace as well. And then when you turn to look at sports, you're not starting to notice that, yes, this is a problem. Some of the best athletes must have some of the mental capacity to be great coaches and great athletic directors as well. They understand the game. So they should understand how it works. So I think people are starting to notice that that is a problem. And some people are starting to try to make changes.
Okay. So trying to bring greater inclusion to the sports system is one thing. You have clearly an interest in human rights, more broadly speaking. Do you feel that athletes and sport can, either through calls for justice or by modeling inclusion, do you think they can drive progress and greater inclusion in wider society?
I think that they can. Sports has a way of bringing people together. People rally behind sports teams in a way that I rarely see in other areas. So I definitely think that that is possible, but it also places a greater burden on those BIPOC players to speak out and use their platform to say, like, this is unjust, this is unfair, and to use that as a voice within the broader society.
Interesting. And if there's pressure, do you think, looking at this from the other side of the equation, do you think there are unfair levels of pressure on racial minority athletes to speak out?
I think there is, especially in a system where it's you can come and play, but do so quietly. Like, come and play, but don't speak out about any of your issues. So I definitely think that there is a pressure. And I think once we all get together, all races together, then some change can actually be made.
What do you think would need to happen within the sports system, from your perspective as someone who is very recently been in the collegiate sports system. What would have to happen to make it easier and more welcome for athletes who want to speak out on anti-racism issues to do so?
I think an important thing would be having support from their school. I think, and that comes from their coach, the athletic director, the president of the university, knowing that it is okay to have these opinions and that you will not be benched or shunned, for lack of a better word, for actually speaking out against these injustices that you see. I think that's a very important part, especially with the power imbalance with university sports. I think some athletes may fear that if they do speak out and they don't get the support from their school, they may lose their scholarship money, or they may not be able to play, which could affect if they have plans to play professionally, that could affect that as well. So I think that having the support throughout the organization would be really beneficial.
I see. So you're saying that, if I understand you correctly, that there's some people who have a reasonable fear that they will be perceived as not being a team player if they speak out on issues that make other people uncomfortable.
I think so, yes.
And has that changed at all during this? Do you have a sense of whether that is changing as a result of the social movement around Black Lives Matter and the very high profile of athletes, professional athletes who have chosen to speak out? Has that made it easier for student athletes, or has that increased the pressure on student athletes not to go down that path?
I think in some ways it has made it easier for student athletes to speak out because they see essentially their idols doing the same things. And if they want to emulate them on the field or on the court, they may want to emulate them in other areas of their life as well. But I still do think that there is added pressure because change comes very difficult and a lot of institutions resist change. So when you want to do something differently, there is going to be added pressure and there is going to be some turmoil to get to the desired results.
Thank you. Thank you. We'll now move on to Alex. Alex, I hope you won't hold my quotation of a former justice minister against me, since you do work for the Department of Justice.
Not at all. And whatever I say today, I don't represent the Department of Justice. I represent myself.
Well, with that in mind, you've been a student athlete yourself. You've been involved since being a student in providing advice and counsel to students in the collegiate sports system, and you have been involved in public affairs and public policy through your professional role. If you were providing advice to a racial or perhaps a student who is a member of a racial or sexual minority who is thinking about speaking out on an issue, on the issue of inclusion that might make his or her peers feel uncomfortable, what advice would you give that person?
Yeah, I mean, this has happened in real time. I had a chance to speak with my alma mater, University of Manitoba, and I had a chance to speak with also recently, or not too long ago, University of Ottawa rugby team, and it was on these issues of inclusion. The issue was live. This was soon thereafter George Floyd incident. So students felt the need to do something. They felt a sense of responsibility. They felt, quite frankly, there was a greater social issue outside the sport that they participate in. So, yeah, I was counseled to some students to say, what can I do or should I do? And the only advice I could give them was to say, listen, you have to, I think this is a chance and an opportunity for you to express yourself. I think if you lose that opportunity and time to be able to state what's been on your mind for a number of years, I think they would regret that, quite frankly. And I said, listen, speak with your classmates, speak with your teammates, and speak with the coach and say, this is what I would like to do. This is what I'm intending to do. Can I get the support from you that I need? And I think more often than not, at least with the coaches I've dealt with, they got that support. Now, with the teammates, I think, and Lashante sort of spoke of this, sports has a way of bringing together people that might not necessarily hang out in the same corners, okay? And I think a real teammate would support another, even if they're not able to experience the same love or that sense of empathy. I still think they can have a rational compassion to say, this is my friend, He's going through something. I may not get it, but I have to support him. And that's what I advise. I mean, I think there's a way to do it and to do it right. But I think the student would regret it if they sort of said, I don't want to, I want to do this, but I'm too fearful, or I just don't have the courage. I think they would regret that later in their life. So I said, if I were you, I would do it, but here's the steps I would go about doing it. In other words, I don't feel the blind side of university, or blindside your coach, or blindside your teammates. Very transparent of what you intend to do, and seek to say, I am doing this. Can I get your support on it? I think the reception will be, it should be fair. And if it isn't, you'll have to question, should I be there anyways, quite frankly?
Okay. Devin brought up the famous, iconic moment of when the three Olympic athletes raised their fist in protest in 1968 Olympics. And I think for many people who are involved in both sport and in the struggle against racism, that is a moment from which they draw great inspiration, myself included. But I'm conscious of the fact that those three men paid a terrible price for their entire lives. I can see for their willingness to speak up, and the power of the power of what they did was mirrored by the power of the backlash against them.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying, that when you're speaking to a young person, that no one wants to live in regret. What do you say to a young person who says, I don't want to live in regret, but I also don't want to live with the pain and the punishment of having spoken truth to power?
Certainly, and I would certainly respect that. I think timing is everything, and I think preparation is everything as well. I think it's how you go about it. I mean, I think one should also seek counsel from a close friend, someone away from maybe the sport itself or the university or something of that nature, and seek counsel. And it all depends on what you're deciding to do, right? What is the platform, and what are you planning on saying? But I would certainly respect one's decision to say, I don't want to place myself in this light. I can respect that. I remember when I was in law school, and there was a few Black law students that were in the class. And anytime there came an issue of race that came up in the constitutional class or the human rights class, the professor would point toward us and expect us to sort of rebut what another person's saying. And some of the students it drove them crazy. Okay. I took that burden on. I didn't mind doing it, but I respected and I understood the other classmates. They just wanted to be law students. Right? Sometimes you just want to be a regular person. You don't want to be the hero. You just want to participate in the sport that you love. But yeah, you have to make those choices, and that's life. That's being an adult, and that's making adult decisions. I certainly respect it, but there comes time when, I might have to speak, and irrespective of there may be a consequence. I think it can be measured to determine what that consequence will be, and that's to seek counsel to make sure that some of those whatever may happen may be mitigated by the way you approach the situation.
Thank you. Well, we'll now move into a general discussion with our three panelists. All three of you, please feel free to jump in with any thoughts that might have been provoked by the observations of your colleagues. But I'll start off with one. I'll circle back to Devin. Devin, you mentioned what I would describe as quite a landmark set of articles that you and your colleagues at the CBC wrote investigating racism and inclusion within the Canadian sports system, and in particular within the architecture of Canadian sport governing bodies. I think you're right when you say that we beguile ourselves as Canadians if we say we are somehow different from the United States or different from other countries. That's a bit of a comforting fiction that we tell ourselves to feel morally superior to countries that aren't that different from ourselves. But certainly one of the differences in Canada is that sport organizations rely very heavily on public funding to survive. With that in mind, why is it, in your view, that given the massive asymmetry of power and massive asymmetry of racial and ethnic and gender representation in the corridors of power of sport organizations, why is it that public funders have not required sport organizations in Canada to adhere to public values in exchange for receiving public funds?
It's a big question. It's one we looked closely at. It's one I've been investigating for years at the CBC. Canada's sports framework is disjointed and fractured at the best of times. I think the funding models are a bit of an issue when we talk about social issues and issues of race, issues of sexual abuse. All of these conversations, I think, are affected by some of the funding model. And uh, I also believe that there are blind spots, right? People hire what they know and who they know. And I'm now talking about exactly what we found in our investigation. When we looked at 100 of the top positions within the national sport organizations in this country, as well as the Canadian Olympic Committee Board of Governors, it was a very stark picture. And again, when we presented these findings, I don't want to make it sound like I believe what we brought together and the full package of what we found was jolting and maybe shocking to some, but I don't think this is a surprise for people who pay attention. What we did, though, is we just presented it in a very clear, matter of fact, open way for people to see in a quantifiable way. And I think people were jarred by that. I don't think the Canadian media have done enough to really articulate the landscape of this. And I think finally we're seeing pressure put on these national sport organizations to better reflect how diverse this country is. Lashante said something, you guys are both student athletes, and you said something that really tweaked a conversation I had with Tanisha Gittens, the Concordia University women's basketball coach. She was finally, after many, many, many years of trying to become a head coach and was passed over despite a lot of success, passed over and over and over, she was finally given the chance to be the head coach at Concordia University. And she said, I'm taking matters into my own hands and I am hiring a completely BIPOC coaching staff, because she said, if I don't, nobody will. And she talked about what Lashante just shared about the fact that as a player, she didn't feel she had safe spaces to go and share and talk to people. And so she wanted to provide that and take matters into your own hands. But to your point, Akaash, I really believe the Canadian public um, hasn't been educated enough on the key positions of power within the Canadian sports framework, and how when you're sitting at a board table and when decisions are being made, the blind spots you have by not having a diverse group of people at that table. And now I think we're finally seeing that business is better, athletes are healthier, and the sport ecosystem is healthier when the people at the top better reflect the athletes who are playing on the field.
Thank you. Well, Lashante, that I will turn Devin's observation to you then, to the question of, actually, let me look at it from the other side. One of the dynamics that seems to be driving this conversation and has caused the conversation about race and inclusion more generally, as well as in sport, to have come to the surface, is the power of youth activism and the power of social media in allowing people to see behind the curtain. Devin has just said that one of the factors that has held back progress is that Canadians aren't aware of the deep asymmetry between the people who govern sport and the people whose bodies make sport run. For yourself, as if I may say, someone who is still at university now and is part of that generation that has championed that kind of change, do you think that is sustainable? What I mean by that is that the other side of social media is that attention spans are very short, that things that are calamitous and catastrophic today are forgotten tomorrow. Do you have a sense of whether the momentum that has been generated by young people through the use of social media and through finding their voices, do you think that's going to be sustained over the long term, or do you think that people in the corridors of power are just waiting it out?
I agree that with social media comes short attention spans. I think the good thing about it, though, is that it doesn't rely on only one person. So a post that one person makes can be reposted and and a lot of different people talk about it and they can bring it up. So in that way, I think that it can be sustained. But I see the other argument as well. And I think that to start, I think a lot of institutions will see how long can we wait this out before we actually have to change something. So it will be on the collective society to keep pushing it forward and sort of force their hand to actually make change.
And for someone in the midst of that debate, what do you think, what incentives, or what do you think could happen for people who want to see change but may not have their hands on the levers of power? So fans may not have their hands directly on the levers of power. Fans, concerned Canadians, what do you think that they can do, people who are watching this conversation now, what do you think they can do to try to bolster what you and your peers are doing?
I think that an interesting point was brought up earlier, and that is that the underlying underneath sport, it all comes down to economics, and sports make money for universities, for institutions. So I think that as a fan, if collectively you decide unless this institution makes change, we're not going to support these games, I think that would be something that could make a difference. Or as players collectively as a team, if the institution doesn't make change, we're not going to play this game. Because if we don't play, we lose that game, and that affects the ranking. So I think in that way, there are things that people can do to kind of force the powers to make some changes.
That's a very interesting idea. I mean, I'm reminded of the women's soccer team in the United States who went on strike for equal pay. So the idea, and I can tell you my experience, the idea of a player strike, even in amateur sport, sends frissons of terror down the spines of leagues and owners. But the idea of a fan strike, that is very interesting. That is very interesting. Hang on to that one. Alex, let me ask you then, assuming that the pressure that is coming from young Canadians is sustained and builds over time, assuming that the work exposing the issues in social exclusion and racism in sport that have been surfaced by Devin continues to tug upon the public conscience. For yourself, as someone who's been involved in the architecture of the law and in the architecture of public policy, what do you think would have to be the next step or to put pressure on decision makers to actually act rather than emote? I mean, we've just been through a general election, and my own experience, my own assessment, I would say politicians have become adept at expressing sympathy, but not so adept at connecting that expressed sympathy to action. What do you think would need to happen for the people who in Canada fund sport and regulate sport to say that we need to act to ensure that sport reflects the values of Canadians?
Yeah. I think that, it's a good question, but I think the answer is quite simple. Politicians, decision makers, institutions, federations, national teams, they all respond to pressure, right? And I think sometimes we tend to put the student athlete or the person who's a member of a BIPOC community, that it's their responsibility to go out and apply that pressure. That's part of it. But I think if you're getting a grassroots movement, and during George Floyd, we saw that. We saw the marches where you were getting people of all colors because they were tired of an injustice. They saw it, and it could have been a person, black, white, Puerto Rican, Chinese, it doesn't matter. They were saying, I don't believe this should have happened, and I'm going to protest against it. So I think if you get more of a grassroots movement, other people other than BIPOC community that are applying pressure, I think you will get that sense of pressure on the decision makers to do something. Because if there's no pressure, I think what they'll default to do is status quo, which means we will do the things that we've done in the past and we will wait it out if we can wait it out. But everyone responds to pressure. And specifically, that's coming in the form of media, or it's coming from, to the politicians, whoever it may be, who is receiving this. They will respond to pressure, but it needs to be more of a grassroots thing, I think, where other people are speaking on behalf of just the impacted individuals.
That's interesting. So it has to be a public movement involving the people who are directly affected, but also people who may not think of themselves as being directly affected.
Absolutely, because if you look at this, it's a civil rights. It's what we've seen in the civil rights movement earlier. It just didn't have an impact on a whole movement just because Black people in the South were saying, "Oh, we need things to change." There was other groups who were part of that and who said, "Listen, there is something wrong with this. I may not understand every issue that's going through someone in the South. If I'm a person from New York and upstate New York and I'm white, I might not understand what someone from Alabama is going through. But what I think they had recognized was that everyone's entitled to a basic human right. When something is wrong, I don't think we need to even show empathy. We can just show rational compassion to say, that is wrong, we should do better. And I think everyone can get on board of that when I think it's presented to them. Now, it has to be presented to them. So articles that Devin and some of his associates have been doing at the CBC, they're important and they stay live and for people to read as long as those articles and those video programming are on the site. And I think people do read them and that can have an impact. So I think other media need to get involved, not just Devin, no offense, at the CBC. Other people can pick up on that and other parts of it. And I think, again, what are we asking people to do is the greatest thing, is to be transcendent. How do I step outside of what my normal comfort zone is, put away my biases so I can see something objectively? That is the greatest trick that we've been seeing in time. Everyone has tried to do it. How do we do it? How do we get the general public to be more transcendent so they make these objective decisions when it goes about hiring and who's going to be in certain roles and how other communities may be impacted? That's what we're asking. I think we can achieve it, but it's not just going to be one group who's going to be applying that pressure where you're going to see that result.
Thank you.
Can I jump in really quickly, Akaash, because I want to elevate and thank Alex for saying that, because I think it's such a profound thought. Because you talk about comfort zone. This was really important work in our CBC sports department. But when you talk about the framework, and when you talk about holding people to account and asking these institutions, hefty, powerful sporting institutions, when we ask them very pointed questions and we're trying to hold them to account, there were a lot of people that didn't like our reporting. And in a lot of ways, we were put out of our comfort zone in taking this on. And so I think it's just a really good point to hammer home that Alex made, is that, I think collectively we all have work to do, and it is a collective undertaking of all of us. And there was pushback, and the systemic racism that exists and the power brokers that are in these positions upholding it don't like to be held accountable. And I think it's incumbent upon journalists to continue to ask those difficult questions.
Thank you. On the subject of difficult questions, I would encourage everyone who's watching this webinar, if you have questions, please type them into the chat bar, which I can't see, but one of my colleagues will put your questions up on the screen, and I'll be more than happy to relay them to the panelists. While those are coming in, let me, if I may continue with that, Devin, your point about, and Alex's point about the role of the media in making the case to Canadians at large, it strikes me that there are two kinds of issues. One, a moral issue, and two, a self-interested issue. The moral issue, I think, is straightforward, that we should treat our fellow human beings with the same dignity that we would expect for ourselves. That may appeal to many people, but it doesn't always motivate everyone. But especially in the business of sport, there's the question of, well, if I were doing something, let's say I were running Athletics Canada, and I were doing something that meant that all of the sprinters were running 20% slower, no one would stop. Everyone would say, you have to stop doing that. In the management and governance of sport organizations, if there are practices that mean that 20% of the population is excluded from consideration, that means, other things being equal, that the management and leadership of sport organizations will be 20% lower and 20% less effective. do you think that the public is receptive to the argument that greater inclusion is not just in the interest of those who are being excluded, that it is in their own interest and the interest of the country?
This all seems pretty clear when you lay it out like that, doesn't it? Yeah, I believe as we continue to tell these stories about the impact of what it, to me, what I found, here's how I'll answer this question, because I think there are a lot of tentacles to that. But here's how I'll answer this question. A lot of these conversations that can be uncomfortable for a lot of people are subtle and nuanced. And I think when we start to dig into this and we start to have really sort of frank, vulnerable, authentic conversations about the systemic issues that exist within our sporting systems and hear the stories of affected people. And when I say nuanced, I think about a coach like Clayton Pottinger out in BC, who for years and years and years had one of the winningest record in the college ranks, but was passed over and over and over to be a university coach. He finally got a coaching position at the University of British Columbia. When we talked to him about that, would he go as far as to say that it was overt racism at play, that he never got a head coaching position? Absolutely not. But was there always that underlying film and residue of why he wasn't getting that position? Absolutely. I think these conversations can be uncomfortable. I think they're nuanced, and I think they can be subtle at times. And that's why I believe that a lot of people are unwilling to engage in the journalism of it, in the conversation of it. And that's why I believe we, as journalists, we have an important role to play in all of this, to take these on. And I think in turn, when the Canadian public and society hears these stories of the impact it has on athletes, not only in the field of play, but in their lives, because those two things run parallel with one another, that they are more receptive to that. To me, sport and my journalism has always been about humanizing these athletes who, in many cases, are idolized and put on a pedestal by the fans and by the public, as if they're seemingly unfeeling to the human rights issues that exist. And I think when we humanize it and take a compassionate approach to this conversation, we start to move the needle. That's how I would respond to that.
Thank you. I should also note that we do have a live audience here at Massey College. If any of the members of the audience have questions, please feel free to put them forward. You can wave your hand or jump up and down. Oh, I think we have one.
Yes.
But, it's from Natalie, so she's not going to jump up and down.
Yes, I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for such an enriching conversation. This is the second Massey dialogue that we have on sports. The first one we did was on concussion. And the conclusion of that dialogue was that the leagues knew, the science was there, and nothing was changing. And there was, again, a sense of the resistance to change was profound. And today I hear a little bit the same thing, a little bit more hopeful maybe today because of the great journalism and the great advocacy that has been done. But what is it about sports that makes it almost more resistant to change than other institutions, it seems to me? Is it because what we were told last time was that sports ethos is we should play it just the same way it was played before because that's the essence of sport. And I hear a little bit the same thing here, which is we always done it this way. Reading your report, Devin, was like reading something about what the 1950s look, and nothing had changed since then almost. So what is it about sport that makes it so difficult to change?
Who would like to take that question?
I can jump in.
Alex, thank you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, if you look at sports, we like to see it as the last great meritocracy, and I use that word very loosely. And again, meritocracy in North America, we like to describe our democracy as a meritocracy. The way we run our institutions are a democracy. So if you work hard, if you study, if you train and prepare, then the way we organize our society, you will win that position. That's how we sort of, that's what we put out there to the world. Sports is the same thing. And in sports, it gives the impression that if you run the fastest, it should be easy. If you can run a 100-meter dash in under 10 seconds, you should be able to make a national team. Fair enough. But unfortunately, for those that have been involved with sports of any sort, it's not a meritocracy at certain levels. It just isn't. And as you rise from the athlete through to assistant coach, through the coach, athletic director, president, CEO, moving forward, head of a conference or head of an organization, I think what we're seeing there is this sense of relationships. And that's the system. That's the system that they have perfected over the years. So if you're part of those circles where you can acquire those strong relations and strong connections, where you fit, in quotation marks, within what the organization wants to do, in their world, they see that that's the best way to hire because we're building a culture. That's what they'll tell you. So to say that we're now going to change that culture that they built over hundreds of years of how they hire people to fit in their organization, that's asking them to reverse the success they feel they've had over the years. So that's a difficult thing to do for them, to tell someone we're going to do it differently. And to them, they feel that they are fulfilling the roles of a meritocracy in the way they've set up their system from the inside because they're the benefactor. It is very difficult if you're the benefactor of something to say that it's the wrong way. That's one of the hardest things to do. It really is, because it's being honest and transparent, and it's admitting I may not have been the best person, and I may have got this because myself and Jim go back 20 to 30 years. We played together, and he married my sister's cousin. See, so those are relations. The problem with that is that not all the people are privy and fortunate to be able to break into those relations. So certain groups are left out. And that's sports. That's what we've seen. And that's what we're trying to figure ways to say, okay, how can we first identify this? And how can we change it where we are getting closer to something what we would call a meritocracy in the sport that which we are talking about?
That's interesting. So your sense is that precisely because sport is meant to be a meritocracy, it's more resistant to people saying it's not a meritocracy.
That's right. They almost can't do it, right? Because the system they've built is, in their minds, built in a meritocracy. And part of that is relations. Part of it is building culture. So they see that as fundamental to moving forward what they believe their institution should stand for. So that is a difficult thing to reverse and say, no, we're going to do it differently. You're not necessarily going to hire the people that you know or you work with or you're friends with. We're going to hire based on what the committee says who's more independent. They're going to be like, no, we're not going to have the same culture that we have. That's not the Tiger's way, if that's the name of the institution.
That's interesting. Leshate, I want to pick up on that, and also on a question that Devin raised, and that is the idea that in addition to being able to help people to step outside of the system and think to themselves, look at themselves with a certain amount of self-awareness and the system with self-awareness, Devin raised the idea of people being inspired to change. So for myself, I rode for Canada in equestrian sport at the World Championships. One of my sporting heroes was not an equestrian, but was an athlete, a track and field athlete, Wilma Rudolph. And I think about her I could go on about her for a long time, but the short things I would offer is that the one thing I will offer is that the very first desegregated event ever held in her town, the town where she was born and raised, was her victory parade when she came back from the Olympics with a gold medal. So that was someone who started off with massive amounts of disadvantages, was willing and able to overcome them, and by doing that, was able to a certain extent, dismantle some of the barriers that she had to face. For the new generation of student athletes coming up, do you think there are heroes like that?
I think there are heroes like that, and I think we've seen that recently in a lot of different sports. And then just touching on the previous question a little bit, I think that another reason why sport can seem so resistant to change is because we have a tendency to separate the athlete from the person. So I think a lot of times, no matter what's going on in your life, in other areas, as soon as you step on the court or the field, you're supposed to forget all of that and just perform. So I think having that mindset makes it really difficult to bring in social justice issues or other issues that athletes may actually be dealing with because it's not seen as the place for it. You're
Yeah.
just supposed to come on the field or the court and perform. That's your job. And we forget that the things that impact you as a person will also impact you as an athlete.
So do you think that some teams and some governing bodies look at the human athlete as almost a piece of equipment, the way they would look at a pair of skis or a sled, that this human being is simply part of the machine that brings me victory and success, and if necessary, I will replace that part of the machine with another?
At times, yes, I do think so. Even if you think in other aspects of sport, if you're injured, you can easily be replaced. So sometimes you might not want to fully disclose your injury, or you say that it doesn't hurt as much as it really does, or you're not hurt as badly as you really are, so you can still play. Because time away could mean someone else taking your spot. And I think when you bring that into these issues in the back of your mind as an athlete, you can be thinking, well, if I speak up and the organization disagrees with me, I can easily be replaced.
It's very interesting. It sounds like what you're describing is that there's a risk of dehumanization in the sports system. Interesting.
At times, I think there is.
So we are coming now towards the end of this discussion. I think that we could go on for quite some time, and we probably would if some of our colleagues weren't holding up their fingers to tell us that we're running out of time. I will ask, before we close off, do any of the three of you have any final comments or remarks that you'd like to offer?
I mean, I think the comment was made that this conversation sound hopeful. I think at the core of who I am, I always try and remain hopeful. I'm not naive, however. We didn't get to Rule 50, which of course is the IOC rule banning any sort of protest in the field of play. So when you talk about how far we've advanced from 68 to when I was reporting in Tokyo, we haven't moved that far because the power system is still in place. And so, Lashante made the great point of the dehumanization of athletes. And I'm going to play my small part in closing to make sure that we remember at the heart of the athlete is a human having human experiences outside of the field of play as I prepare to lead some of our coverage at the Winter Olympics just a few months from now. So it's been a pleasure and an honor really to be part of this conversation. And of course, the work continues.
Thank you. Alex, I think you have the opportunity for a final remark.
Absolutely. I think it's for sports organizations, this is a fantastic opportunity. And I think, you look at the Toronto Raptors, and if you use Massey and Jerry, and if they didn't give him an opportunity, which they did, and say, you're going to be our general manager, okay? And the decisions he had to make to acquire Kawhi Leonard. And he was at the top. He was right there as general manager. He rolled the dice, got Kawhi Leonard, Toronto Raptors have an NBA championship. The point is I think sports suffers. If you don't get and gather the best who are capable of producing the best results, I think your sport suffers. If the sport suffers, the community suffers, the fan suffers, the coaches suffer, the players suffer. So I think this is an opportunity that I think we can do better as a society. And I've used this word earlier. We can be transcendent. We just have to learn how to be that way. And I thank you, Akaash, for doing this.
Thank you. Well, it just falls to me now to thank Devin, Lashante, and Alex for joining us and for spending an hour of their time with us. To thank everyone who was part of the audience, both in person and on the web, for being part of an important discussion, and to thank Massey College for hosting this discussion. There's been organized sport as long as there have been societies, and there have been issues with sport as long as there have been societies. But each of you has brought a great deal of passion to this discussion, and I think that demonstrates the power of sport, that it does touch us in a very deep way, a very emotional way, and that, howsoever imperfectly, it appeals to the high ideals of meritocracy, that it's possible for people to face off against one another in honorable competition. If the institutions have not always lived up to that ideal, it's up to all of us who are part of this conversation to push it towards that ideal. And I thank all of you for doing exactly that today. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.